Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is Wednesday. It is a Knowledge Bolide Hangout, and it's the one we've been waiting for. Um, we have several people in the meteorite community who specialize in certain things, whether they're collectors, whether they are scientists, or whether they're like our guest, Craig Zlimen, today from Minnesota Meteorites. Craig, how are you, buddy?
I'm good, Topher. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Let me tell everyone why you're such a fantastic guest for us to have and why we're so excited. People may remember Craig from our Tucson sale we did at the Meteorite Mansion. That was a blast to do. But Craig is known in the meteorite community as the person to go to, not only for cutting, and that's a whole nother topic we're not going to get into today, but of restoration, of saving and working on pieces that are in a little bit of worrisome condition. So there's only one of Craig, and there's so many collectors out there and so many pieces in their collections, and we try to educate people of how to put them in their collection safely and how to store them and how to be your own curator. So this is going to be episode 1 of probably 2 or 3 videos with Craig as our guest. And I'm really going to turn it over to Craig. He's going to be showing us some of his secrets and tricks so people will stop asking him to care for their meteorites and learn how to be a collector by themselves. And that includes me. I have a 2-kilo Canyon Diablo. It's showing signs of rust. I would normally send it to Craig, but I'm going to use this episode and the following ones to educate myself so I can restore that iron. So stay tuned on the channel for a video that follows that process. But Craig, you rusty old crack, how are you, man?
With an intro like that, I mean, rusty and old, definitely. Thanks for that. I'm good.
Good.
You're absolutely right. Probably, the most common request I get multiple times in a day is, "Hey, I've got something, it's rusting. Can I send it to you to fix?" My wife will tell you I have a very hard time saying no to people, even when I should be saying no to people. And rust generally, as you'll see through the series, can take a long time to effectively treat completely. And so when it's nothing to get a 2-year backup on stabilization and rust removal. So my hope is by sharing this information, some of the easy stuff, you can prevent ever needing my services to really overhaul whatever piece you have. Or when it's done, maybe you'll feel ambitious and like you want to try it yourself, which is fantastic.
One of the things is if you find a problem early and treat it early, it's less treatment and less risk, as you're going to explain.
Exactly correct. So I guess I'm going to start just briefly by saying it's sort of a definitional thing. Stable is always relative. It is not 100%. And I say that because if you go buy a hammer at the hardware store and you leave it out in the rain, it's going to be rusty the next day. If you go buy a shovel and you put it in wet dirt the next day, it's going to be rusty. Terrestrial steel that's been worked over and over is essentially chloride free. And chlorides, which we'll talk about in a minute, are what promote rust for meteorites. They're still going to rust. So stabilization, prevention, it's a process. It's a continuum more than an endpoint. So I would encourage people not to freak out about rust. We're going to teach you how to handle it. And in most cases, you can take care of it really, really easily. And I'm going to show you a little magic trick here. Some of the stuff I'm going to teach you are things I actually paid to learn from people who have been doing this a lot longer than I am. Some of it is stuff we devised on our own, but all of it is something that you can literally do in your garage or your basement. The only thing I would say is for some of it, you're going to want some ventilation because it's stinky. Other than that, my wife is shaking her head behind the camera.
And because this is on my channel, I will tell everyone to please make sure if you're going to do anything with chemicals, read the instructions and warnings on the container itself and use all the precautions they recommend. Craig?
Yes, rules are for followers, Topher. No, I'm kidding. I'm completely joking. You'll see I have gloves on. We're not really going to be dealing with any super caustic chemicals in this episode, but I am wearing gloves mostly because when you're handling alcohol or lacquer thinner, you're going to know when you have a cut. And so this prevents that. It prevents staining. You'll see this is critical if you want to stay married. Wear old clothes that you can stain and get holes in and things like that. Because if not, your wardrobe shrinks very quickly and your wife gets very unhappy with you.
Yeah.
Friend told me that. But so I'm just going to walk you through some of the supplies that I would recommend you have. Always tell people you want to have lacquer thinner, which is not paint thinner. It's actually quite different. Lacquer thinner will dissolve almost anything. And that includes paints. As most of you know, the irons I deal with, I will coat. This will get rid of your coating, doesn't hurt the irons at all. It also does a great job of getting rid of moisture. So lacquer thinner, but it will dissolve your gloves very quickly. These are surgical gloves. They can stand up to it a little better, but if you're using just your standard, not latex, not latex, the other,
Nitrile.
yeah, what Topher said. This will dissolve them very quickly. So just be aware, you actually do want to wear latex or some kind of thick gardening gloves or something like that. And then the other thing I have, which I use when I'm not removing paints to dry things off and clean things, is just denatured alcohol. Works wonderfully. I will say alcohol is hydrophilic. So if you don't have a full container and it's not sealed, it will pull moisture out of the air eventually. So, it's got a shelf life of about a year, and then it's going to have water in it. Thankfully, that water is just going to be from the air. So it's essentially, it won't have any chlorine, it won't have any salt or anything like that. So it's not a huge deal, but it'll be more like 70% rubbing alcohol as opposed to pure alcohol. And let's see, the other, so this is my secret sauce, guys. If you're going to get rid of rust, this is what you need. It is CLR is also my friend, but crud cutter, rust cutter, which is getting sort of challenging to get. This is the stuff, and I'm going to just show you something real quickly. You can see this is a big allotai slice, and you can see this poor allotai slice has seen its better days. But I want you to look at it now, and then I'm just going to spray this stuff on it. And my wife loves the smell, so if you hear complaining in the background, it's her.
It's
And I
so
believe
bad.
she's actually on the camera, so thank you for your help as well.
Oh, for sure.
Sorry about that. Okay, so we're gonna let that. Well, let's see. Maybe I'll just wipe it off. Actually, there might be some paint on it. No, it's coming off. So we're gonna leave that sit. And before this episode is out, we're gonna come back to it. And this thing is gonna look unrecognizably clean. Rust cutter. This is your friend.
Nice.
The other thing, CLR, also your friend, and they serve two similar but different purposes. And I'll tell you that right now. So rust cutter will take away, it will remove any rust you have. And that includes deep in cracks. That's hugely important because rust begets rust. If you have ferric oxide and you add chlorine, then you get ferric chloride and water, and that's bad. It becomes a self-perpetuating process. So the advantage of using this rust dissolver is that it penetrates deep, and the rust is gone. It's neutralized. And this you can actually leave on the irons. If I have ruster irons, I will spray this on and just leave them until I'm ready to work with them.
Wow,
and it will
because that's always I'm sorry, Craig. That's always a concern when you're using any acid that you don't, or anything acidic. You don't want to leave it. You want to mind the time that it's on your surface.
Correct. And CLR, if you leave it on and don't clean it well, it will rust. It will perpetuate rust. It will cause the rust. So but the crud cutter, if you have a fully finished etched iron, it will make it look darker. So the finish will look a little bit different, which is why after you crud cutter it, you can wipe it with CLR and then clean it off in alcohol, and then it will go back to its original luster. So it's sort of a lot of chemical work, but it's all mild stuff. It's similar to vinegar, and it works like a charm. In fact, if you just come look, I haven't touched this, but you can see this is what it looked like, and you can see it's already going back to its silvery cell. So by the end of the show, you won't even see any rust. It'll just be gone. Crud cutter, very important. Other things you need a lot of this. Paper towels. We go through. I can't even tell you how many cases of paper towels we go through in a week. It's important because when you're working with meteorites and you take it from an acidic environment to a non-acidic, you're etching, you're cleaning, you can't cross-contaminate. And that sounds so simple, but if you're doing 30 or 40 slices, it actually becomes incredibly challenging. And I would never normally set up this close together because inevitably you'll get splashes back and forth. So lots of paper towel. This is about $4 at the grocery store, Arm & Hammer wash soda. It's sodium carbonate, not sodium bicarbonate, just sodium carbonate to neutralize all of your acids. You can use it after etching, you can use it after cleaning, you can use it after whatever you want. And I think other than that, basic stuff. So you're going to need containers for cleaning. I deliberately brought a hodgepodge of stuff because, like your clothes, you're going to ruin them. And your wife is not happy when you use a good baking dishes. I've heard.
I've noticed that all those pans are plastic.
Yes. Yes. So I use plastic just because it can withstand whatever chemical stuff we have. It's easy to clean. And in this, I mean, some of these are just takeout containers. Literally, I save plastic containers because they're easy to use, they're disposable.
No, and, because you're cheap.
And they're cheap. That's exactly right. They're cheap. You're gonna we burn through a lot of these things. So plastic containers, you can get dirty. And then the last two important things, heat gun, which you don't actually need, but I highly recommend it, and they're not expensive, because that will help to quickly dry once you're done and before you put them in the oven, which we'll talk about later. And then for deeper rust, you're going to want a palm sander. As you can see, this one's got some miles on it. It's pretty much worn smooth around the edges. We put everything through the ringer here, but just a palm sander. And this is 400 grit, 240, 400. If you're going to resurface something, either of those work fine. You can go 240, 400, or you can leave it at 240, whatever works. But we'll talk more about that later, because in this particular episode, I think we're going to try to stick with the easier cleaning methods. So that's the skinny. All right, so those are the products you're going to need. And of course, then you're going to need a meteorite that needs some cleaning. One of the questions people always ask is, what's a good meteorite to buy if you don't want it to rust? So I figured we'll just super quick run through that. And I think on the piece of paper that I use, they're the bad bees: Brahine, Brenham, bad; Saracho, not a bee, bad; Admire. These are habitually rusting, notoriously rusting meteorites that have been exposed to terrestrial chlorides for a long time. They absorb them, and then what happens? You get the water, the H2O, and the oxygen hitting the chlorides. It causes, basically it turns it into ferric oxide and ferric chloride, and that becomes self-perpetuating. Then you have a powerful acid and and water that helps it to seep in deeper and deeper. And that's why when we say meteorites rust from the inside out, it's because the chlorides inside the iron that are promoting the rust. And that's what will make it accelerate quickly. So there's your chemistry lesson for today. It's probably wrong, and if Getty's out there, he can correct me later. What can you do to prevent rust? Well, buying meteorites that are rust resistant, so found in a dry environment, maybe newer falls. Sacodolin almost never rusts significantly because Sacodolin was found almost immediately after it fell, so it didn't have time to absorb any terrestrial chlorides. Gibeon in the desert, notoriously rust resistance on its own. Actually, Topher etched this end, and it's not been covered with anything. It's been sitting out in my kitchen, literally. And it's still not rusting, so that's a good thing. Gibeon is largely rust resistant. Sinchen is incredibly rust resistant. Sacodolin is incredibly rust resistant. But at the end of the day, they're all irons, and even if they're rust resistant, they can still rust. So
when it comes to irons, you should avoid. You mentioned to me Campo, Munion Alusta, St. Alban, and Toluca.
You are spot on. All of those have been on Earth a long time. Probably the worst is Munion Alusta, and I'll show you a couple nice pieces of that. That's over 1.5 million years terrestrial weathering, and it's sat in Sweden in the bottom of a bog and lived through 3 ice ages, getting ripped back and forth. So a lot of moisture, a lot of exposure, and that takes its toll over time. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't own Munion Alusta, and I'm going to show you how beautiful they can look. And it absolutely can be stabilized, and it absolutely, even if it's not stabilized, if you care for it properly from the time you cut it until the time you display it, Munio can last many years without even needing to refresh. So while yes, you know, you do need to watch what you buy. If you know how to take care of them, you're still going to be able to own some of these traditional rusters with a little bit of extra care.
Perfect.
All right, we're going to come back to this. I'm just going to show you real quickly how nice and light that's getting. So again, that's my magic trick. That will make all of the rust just completely go away. But we'll look at that again later. People ask, how do I store things? This is how I store things out in the open so that people can touch them, and I can go to schools and kids can handle them. Let's see. We'll start on the other ends. We've got a Munionalusta slice with some nice inclusions in it. That's been open. We've got a new Pallasite, actually, that seems to be nice and rust resistant. Behind that, we've got a Brahim a Brenham that was completely rusted away. I didn't think I'd be able to save that. And now it's beautiful. It's been completely stable, and I love it. We have a Nantan that I stabilized 4-5 years ago. This goes to schools with me everywhere, and no rust. It's in fine shape. So Pallasites, even the NWA Pallasites, a lot of them were buried and absorbed moisture over time. They need stabilizing, but when they're stable, they're good. A brand new iron that I call the Infinity Iron because the etch seems to just go on forever when you look close. These are all ownable irons, with the caveat that if you are worried about irons falling apart, whole irons have been on the planet for 5,000, a million, 3 million years. And owning a whole iron, I often hear people say, can I stabilize it? Because, for example, this is an Odessa that's going to get cut. You can see, sure, there's some rust on the outside. There's a nice patina, but that patina is protective. That patina will prevent moisture and oxygen from getting down to the fresh iron. And so whole irons generally, I've got a Campo down on the other end. I've got a small Campo in the front that's clean. And then I've got a big ugly Serrachil behind it. If you don't cut them, those will be good forever. They will outlive your grandkids' grandkids. So that's another suggestion if somebody is worried about irons falling apart, keep them whole. Of course, then you don't get to see the pattern. And once you cut a face, then you increase the surface area, you increase the exposure to oxygen and water, and it's not as fun. So, questions?
Do you often have to do any work on mesositerites or winonites, or do they not have enough metal in them?
No, meso on rare occasion, yes, but it's usually a prep problem as opposed to a meteorite problem. And winonites are amazingly resilient. So I don't know if they're newer or if, like you said, you know, the iron is just separated enough. But very seldom, unless they're poorly prepped, do you run into any issues with those rusting irons. Good question. All right, so let's get to business. So if you have a meteorite, like for example, this is a Campo slice. This Campo slice, it's almost as old as I am. And it was stabilized years ago, but you can see that there's little cracks that have rust in them. And on the backside, basically the same, just shallow little lines of rust that we're gonna make go away here quick and easy. This is sealed, as I said, and this is where your lacquer thinner. And I'm going to use this. So here's your trays. I'm going to put a little bit just on top. We're only going to do a quarter of this just for demonstration purposes, but that's okay. Lacquer thinner, like I said, it takes anything off of anything and in short order. So you want to get the paint off before you start working on it. Or if you're a person who doesn't like having coatings, lacquer thinner is your friend. It literally just wipes off. And it doesn't hurt the iron. And then you have a non-coated iron meteorite. And it's no more prone to rust because of the lacquer thinner. It would be more prone to rust because it's exposed to more air, but it's not because of anything related to the lacquer thinner. Okay. So now in this case, it does penetrate fairly deeply. It's not just a surface rust. So I'm going to use my magic spray. Again, this is Crud Cutter Rust Cutter. And I'm just going to work it in, again, gloved hand with my finger. We may actually end up just letting this sit for a few minutes. You can leave it sit, well, really indefinitely. But the rust, we'll let that dissolve itself. It's simple. If it's coated, you have to take the coating off. The coating is there specifically to prevent moisture from getting into the meteorite. So it's very difficult to clean it if you have or re-etch it if you have a coating on it. If it's not coated, say this one is actually fresh out of electrolysis, so it's discolored, but you can see there's still some rust, and that actually isn't invasive rust, that's leftovers. But we'll do the same thing. We'll just make that go away, make my wife nose very happy. But the crust cutter does an amazing job of getting through it, and I may actually have to let this one sit for a bit. Some people will take a toothbrush if you're in more of a hurry. I would prefer to just let it soak in and let it do its job, and then we'll come back to that in just a second.
I think that by letting it sit in it would actually go to any crevice or air hole.
Exactly. And so you're going to get not just the surface rust, but you're going to get rid of your rust converter is going to get rid of the deep rust as well. And I'm still going to respray. And again, in normal time, if I wasn't doing it on TV, I would let this soak. Anytime it's in the cracks, I would let it soak at least an hour, and usually overnight. We don't have time to let it soak overnight, so that's fine. What I'm going to do is actually come back to this big honker that we started on, and you can see the only rust left really right now is the deeper, more invasive rust. Now this one I would definitely
overnight
resand, because you're going to have pitting from the, and I will resand it because you're going to have pitting from the deep rust. But you can see it's mostly clean at this point. So now if you have a mostly clean meteorite, and here's the one I was looking for, sitting right in front of me with just some little rust strips on the bottom, we're going to make that go away super quick. And now we can do the full process.
And nothing that you're currently showing us is affecting the etch or the brightness of the piece with the one thing that you mentioned, darkening it a little bit.
Correct. And we can reverse that darkening quite easily. And I'll show you how to do that in just a second.
Nice.
So again, I'm rubbing, just trying to work it into these deep spots so that it comes out. This actually happens to be a new iron. It's not yet classified. It's full of bugs, which is sort of an interesting phenomenon.
Oh.
But it was etched. It is finished. So we're going to just almost gone. Almost gone. Okay. So we're going to say the rust is now gone. Now we're going to pull out our next trusty black container. And again, watch for your cross contamination. This time I'm just going to take some ethanol or denatured alcohol. Wipe it off. Now, ideally, I would do multiple, if I had multiple pieces to do, I would do multiple pieces, leave them in the alcohol, and then when I'm done, come back with clean hands. This is really the most critical and the easiest part to screw up. So then I come and I'm going to wipe off the alcohol and the crud cutter. And again, it will actually sit in the cracks. But you can see this one, I don't even know that I would do anything from a re-etch standpoint, but the rust is gone. Mm-hmm. And it will stay gone. So now you have a piece that had fairly deep rust, but is like new. And I actually wouldn't, this iron has been reasonably stable, so I would not anticipate that this is going to rust again. Same situation. Let's see how we're doing here on the Campo. This one's ready to go, but we'll need etching. So this one also cleared up. See what we have on the other side. We do have.
It's absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing that you can actively take off decades and centuries and millennia of stuff without hurting the piece and overnight, momentarily.
Yes, that's it's kind of fun. So what I would do now, so we've cleaned this one off, we've removed the rust, we've rinsed it in alcohol, I wiped it off. So now I would normally put it in the oven for at least an hour. If it were a newly stabilized piece or newly cut piece, newly etched, where it's been exposed to water for a long time, it's actually recommended 24 hours. And I learned that the hard way.
Are you talking about like 190 degrees, something like that, 170?
150 to 170. Irons tolerate, irons will tolerate 190, 250. Now, if you're doing pallasites, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, you shouldn't do pallasites. But if you're doing a pallasite and you're trying to dry it, If you go over 180, 190, you can cause the crystals to yellow.
Oh,
So if you have nice green crystals, you don't want to go too high. But most, at least in the US ovens, 170, 150 is the lowest you're going to get them to go, and that works just fine. But time, or you can put them on a hot plate and leave it on low and just let it sit for 24 hours. But drying and improper drying is the #1 cause of rust, whether it's stable or not stable iron. You seal it in or you let it sit in the cracks. It promotes rust deep down in that crack, and over time, it's going to come bubbling up. So what I would do now, we're going to pretend that this was in the oven for a couple hours. Again, it was already dried and been through the oven, and we haven't actually really exposed it to water. It's just been rust remover and alcohol. So I would make sure it's dry. And then I'm going to get my trusty, and I use, everybody asks what kind of clear coat do I use? It is automotive clear. This is not a specific kind. I do use the Rust-Oleum brand, not because I'm a huge lover of Rust-Oleum, but they don't have, there's no water in there. It's an oil-based paint. And many of the other spray paints are water-based. So I would just take this, not aim it at your wife. Once it's fully dried, give it a couple good squirts, and again, that will protect it, and that's it. And now you have what is essentially a newly treated iron, and you can put it back on the shelf and let it sit. In another case, I've got a very small, this is a newly classified fine octahedrite. This is a fine example of being sealed too soon. And you can see it's not invasive rust, it's just a light brown that sits underneath the paint. That's an indicator that either it wasn't completely cleaned, and this was not, it was a type specimen, so it was not designed to be completely clean. It's been sitting in my garage for almost a year. But at that, you do have a little bit of rust underneath. So again, you're going to come in, you're going to take your lacquer thinner, and this doesn't have a thick coating on it, so we're just going to make sure we get all the paint off. And this, which is probably similar to what most of the problems you're going to see out there, will instantly, if I got all the paint off, turn clean. And I'm going to cross contain. Oh, no, there is a little bit in that crack, but you'll be able to see generally without any time. Most of the brown is gone just from wiping it.
wow.
And so I would let it soak to get rid of that brown in the cracks, and then put it in your alcohol, wipe it off, throw it in the oven, dry it, seal it, and you're good to go. So that is like the most straightforward, simple way to do it. If you find that your etch is not as brilliant as it was when you started, this particular rust cutter, it will darken the etch a little bit. So I would then take it, we're going to pretend I didn't seal it. I did that just for show. And then I'd take a paper towel. Again, we try to be environmentally friendly, but man, we hammer the paper towels. Take some CLR. And CLR will also, by the way, I'm going to back up. If you etch something and it is yellow after you etch it, which is almost unavoidable, CLR is your friend. You just wipe it like that, and it will take all the yellowing away instantaneously. And then you're going to just take your alcohol and literally just wipe it, flip it, dry it, and you're going to have removed all of the rust cutter. You'll have removed all of the yellowing. Now we just got to let it dry. And you're good to go. But that's where CLR comes in. So CLR is a fantastic cleaner. It doesn't do deep rust removal. That's going to be your rust cutter. But CLR does a great job of getting rid of yellow from just after etching. If it's been sitting in your cabinet for 5 years, like my big Nantan slice, actually, I was looking at that. I was like, I should probably pull that off and clean it up a little bit. So what I'll do, I'll just pull all the sealant off, wipe it with CLR quick, clean it off with alcohol. Again, put it in the oven. I always dry everything in the oven because that is the one. My wife is smiling because our house often has wonderful smells from the things that I put in the oven. But ovens are critical. You want to make sure you get all of your moisture out of the pieces. So from an iron standpoint, it's really just that simple. There isn't a lot more to do for simple rust removal. When we talk later, we're going to get into more complicated rust removal, which is going to be sanding off some of the deep areas, and then re-etching and stabilizing and all that jazz. Pallasites. Pallasites are the exception to this rule. You can clean a pallasite, as I did. That's fine. That is the best way to treat a pallasite. And I wish I could run in the house and grab a pallasite that's been treated and re-opticoned so you could really see how ugly things get before they get better. But pallasites are something, if you have rust, you know, if you have crystals that are popped, if you have rust along the edges of crystals that haven't yet popped, that you want to get professionally treated. Anytime you work with a pallasite, particularly if you're doing electrolysis, what you're going to find is that rust has built up underneath the crystals in almost all cases. That's where it starts. And when you put it in electrolysis, it removes all of that rust. And what happens to the crystals that were held in by pressure?
They just fall right down to the bottom of the tank.
Right, the crystals fall out. If you have areas like this that have very little iron in between the crystals, you might lose this whole corner, you know, to fall off just because there's not enough iron holding it together, and whatever was holding it between the crystals is now gone. So you have to be very, very careful with pallasites. That is the one thing I would say, and that's the one thing I continue to accept on a regular basis. Pallasites really require somebody who's knows not only how to do it, but finishing pallasites is a multi-step process. So once you get the rust off and you get it to survive the initial problem, which by the way requires I put something called Opticon on the outside before I ever put it in the stabilizer. That will hold it together because they will fall apart. So the glue literally holds it together. You take it out, then I clean it off, then I put more glue on it, and then I do the same on the opposite side. And then we take it out, we dry it, and then I put more glue on both sides, we sand it, we refinish it, we etch it, we dry it again. It's a major process. And if you skip any of those steps, you're going to wind up with a handful of olivine and iron chunks. Nobody really
Craig,
wants.
when you're done that process, if it's done correctly, how thick should a coating on a pallasite slice be? Because there are some that you can get from China where there's more epoxy than pallasite.
So I learned some. I was working with, I'm going to say it wrong, and Scott McGregor can speak up. Grabo Zhang, something like that.
Gyarub Zangbo.
Gyarub Zhang, thank you. Yes. So I got a piece of that, and I was working with it. And interestingly, not only was it epoxied, but they actually seemed to laminate it. You could peel off big floppy. I should brought out. It's a laminate. It's a a 32nd of an inch thick piece of plastic that they heated and put on top of the coating. Overcoating things isn't going to help if the iron isn't stable. Eventually, there will be places that rust, and when it's trapped underneath that, as this piece was back before I was able to restore it, this was coated in a thick piece of epoxy, or thick coating of epoxy. And all it did was under the epoxy, it completely eroded all the iron. And when I got it, I took the epoxy and I peeled it up, and all the crystals came out. All the crystals came out. There's a huge crack that ran all the way to about here. So epoxy is fine. You don't need a thick coating. I just use paint, and the quick spray that I showed you is all that I use.
Yeah. The point was you don't need to coat the thing.
Correct. And all the coating does is make it harder for you to do anything with it afterwards. Typically, when you see the thick epoxy and the thick coatings, that's an indication it's probably a ruster. It's probably not even finished. The vast majority of those aren't even sanded. They literally take them off a wire saw, dry them, coat them, and they live long enough that they can sell them on eBay for cheap in super thin pieces. But once they start to rust, that's it. There's no restoring them. They just fall apart. And in fact, I've seen slabs come in a quarter inch of epoxy, and there's no iron left. It's just all rust trapped inside the epoxy. So it's not about how much you put on top. If you have to put a lot on top, that means you have a problem underneath.
Yeah. All they're really doing is giving you a nice clear window to everyone's failures below.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that goes back to, again, choosing not only what kind of pallasites or iron you're buying. If you buy Sergio, which this is a Sergio, and actually I haven't done anything to this after cutting it, and it really has almost no rust. And this is 3 years old now. It's got a little bit of surface rust down here. I'll probably clean up one of these days. But if you buy a ruster, you should at least expect that you're going to have to do some maintenance on it. You can help prevent rust by keeping things desiccated. I do have bags of this fun stuff. You know, keeping things in a cabinet that's desiccated certainly will help. If you can keep the humidity below 40%, that's good. If you can keep it below 20%, you can almost take things in a pool with you and it's not going to rust. But by and large, I don't like owning meteorites if you can't take them out and handle them. I go to schools all the time and I leave everything out. And I feel like when you have people over, if they want to look at them, if kids want to touch them, my grandkids are here all the time. That's what the coating does. Because an uncoated iron that gets fingerprints on it will rust. It doesn't matter how stable it is because you have salt in your sweat. So that's why I coat everything. And that's my storage technique. I really just try to keep an eye, and if something rusts, it gets stabilized. If it doesn't rust, it doesn't get stabilized. I do have a rule I tell people all the time, and you've all heard this, it's very cliche, but if it isn't broken, don't fix it. So I'll get people who want to send me a Simshan iron and say, hey, I'm really afraid this is going to rust. Will you stabilize it for me? Absolutely not. I'm not going to dunk your iron in a tub of water and redo it and re-expose it to everything so that you can have it back and hope it doesn't rust again. If it's not rusting, leave it alone. If it's rusting, then the quicker you get to fixing it, the better off you're going to be. The longer you wait, the more challenging it's going to be. Make sense? But this is a Munio that I've had. The back is all nice and clean. Actually, I should probably brush off some of it. Just sits in a drawer. But this was stabilized, remains rust-free, even though it's got big cracks in the corners, which would normally harbor rust. But it's in good shape. And again, this is several years old. I would tell people, don't be afraid of irons. Just learn how to take care of them a little bit. And if it shows, if it proves to rust, send her back. We'll get it fixed up and get it back to you.
Yeah, even on that other Mooney slice you just showed with the deep cracks in it, that is one, even if you saw that with active rust in those cracks, these treatments and these things you're showing us today are more than sufficient with a little bit of soaking time.
Correct. And in fact, I think I wiped this off, but if we go back and look, I think our rust, you can see it is darkening the iron just a little bit, but the rust is basically gone. So what I would do now, if I was treating the whole piece, I'd actually take a toothbrush and alcohol and brush it out, make sure I don't see any rust left in there. And it would be a complete treatment for the whole slice. And then I would bring the alcohol in, wipe it off, see what the etch looks like. It'll lighten up here as I get most of the. But a toothbrush will help to get rid of the dark edges on that. And toothbrushes aren't going to hurt your etch at all. They're very soft. I would not use a wire brush. So things to never, ever, ever, ever do. This is probably as important as things to do. Never take and use a wire brush. Never take and use steel wool. People love steel wool. Never take and use rubbing compound for your car. These are all bad things, and your meteorite will suffer for it. When you're cleaning something, if you need to use water, we actually have a service. We use distilled water is all we use. We have city water here, which is chlorinated. It's not softened, but it's chlorinated. If you want to make something rust real fast, put chlorine on it. Does a great job rusting. So we go through 500 gallons of water a month. The amount of distilled water we go through is staggering. It actually becomes a significant business expense because we use it for cutting, we use it for stabilizing, we use it for cleaning, we use it for everything. If you have a well and it's not softened, you can use your well water. If you buy just like drinking water in a bottled water, don't get the one with electrolytes in it. But if you get just filtered water, you should be okay. But we always use only distilled water, or if you have a dehumidifier at home, we collect all the water from our dehumidifiers. Works wonderful because that is essentially distilled water.
I was going to ask about that. That's awesome.
So, and again, once you get it wet, then I put it back in alcohol because that will help to drive the moisture out of the cracks. Almost inevitably, when you pull it out, it's going to be yellow. So then we're going to give it a quick CLR bath back in the alcohol, straight to the oven, leave it sit for 24 hours. If it's clean after 24 hours, let it cool, seal it up. If it has a little bit of yellow, just repeat the process. If you have a little bit of rust in the cracks, which absolutely can happen, especially if it's a thick piece or deep cracks, you will find that the heat will help to force it up, and you'll see it leave a little bit of a discoloration along the crack. Rinse and repeat. Usually you'll only have to do it twice at the most. Sometimes I've had to do it 3 times, but that's also true with electrolysis. It just, again, you're working with a finicky thing, and cracks are small and deep. But if you dry them properly and seal them up, and if they come out of the oven after, a day of drying and there's nothing on them, you're good to go. Don't touch them with a bare hand. Don't touch them with sweaty, greasy hands. Don't go from your, softened city water and wet hands and pick them out of the oven, because then you're exposing them to more stuff. Wear a gloved hand, put them on a paper towel, whatever you want to do. And then one other trick, before I coat things, you can buy something at the store. It's called tack cloth. It's basically just a waxy, sticky cloth. But one of the ways to maintain a nice finish, and I'll show you one here in a second, just take a clean gloved hand, not one that's been in all the chemicals like I have. Again, that's like the #1 way to hurt your pieces, to cross-contaminate. But if I had clean gloves, wipe the dust, and you're going to feel it when you're done, and you're going to feel the difference between when it's new and you first run your hand over it and when it's nice and smooth. It's nice and smooth. Set it down, spray it, you're good to go. For example,
Craig, without really need to be said, but we need to say it. After you take the piece out of the oven, let it cool completely before putting any coating on it.
Exactly. Yep. This is a piece I just did right before the show. It was rusted, and I cleaned it up just to show you. So on the back side, you can still see, and I left this on purpose. This is what it looks like with the rust remover. You can see it's darker on this half. And this is no rust remover. So it will, now you can, if you did rust remover on the whole thing and wipe it off, it's still going to be a little bit darker, but it will be even. And if you coat it, it's going to look fine. This side I cleaned completely, and I actually went over it with CLR and then alcohol again. And then I put it in the oven, and I just sealed this up before the show. And this is one of my favorite irons. It's a brand new classification, and it's just the finest little octahedrite. I love it. But it's reasonably stable, but I always, make sure before I finish them or send them out that we make sure they dry in the oven again after cutting and after finishing, and make sure there's no rust. In this case, there were a couple cracks right back here and right here. There was just a little bit of surface discoloration, which is why I treated it, and now I sealed it. And I'm actually just going to sit on this piece for a while and make sure it doesn't come back. Pieces I've stabilized even just for 3 days and then go and refinish, do fine. So now I'm curious to see if we can cut it down to just purely rust removal, and then go ahead and put it on the shelf. We'll see what it does. The other thing I'll say, Pat, you know this, but anybody who cuts meteorites, if you're cutting irons, we cut with distilled water. You can use oil. Oil on irons, fantastic. Does a great job of helping to never create the rust to begin with. Remember, if you have rust, you need water, you need oxygen, and you need iron, Fe. So if you cut with oil, you remove most of the water from the equation, and it's less likely to rust. But oil is messy. Shake the camera, honey. Is oil messy? That's not the camera, that's your head.
It's very messy, and it's smelly.
Oil is messy, it's stinky, and it's very difficult to clean out of rocks. It's not so bad with irons, but most of what we cut are rocks. And so I generally don't use iron unless I'm doing a huge pallasite. If I'm doing 150 kilo admire, I'm going to cut it with oil. But other than that, I'm going to cut it with water. And the trick to cutting with water, and this is something, again, it's taken me almost 10 years to figure this out, dry that sucker. As soon as they come off the saw, they get sprayed with the rust remover, they get wiped with alcohol, they get thrown in the oven. If you prevent the rust from starting, you don't have to worry about it happening later on. If you just sand it off, which is what we used to do and what I was taught to do, you don't get rust deep down in the cracks, and it will re-rust. And that's exactly what happened with this campo. This was one of the first pieces I ever refinished, and we just etched it. It was stabilized, which is why 95-8% of it is totally clean, but the cracks rusted. We never got the cracks out of the rust. We never did that, and we never dried it appropriately. So those are your lessons. Keep them dry. Get rid of the rust. You have to remove the rust to prevent more rust. But once you get rid of the rust, if you seal it up, you should be in good shape for a long time. Is it a promise it's going to last forever? Absolutely not. Would I expect you to get 5-10 good years? In most cases, yes. If you lived in Georgia, Florida, 2-3 years.
Move.
There's another preparer who's been doing this a lot longer than I have, who actually shared some of the secrets with me. And he to this day says, I won't ship anything to Hawaii and he won't ship anything to Florida because inevitably, eventually heat and humidity are going to cause things to rust. But if they're well cared for and sealed up, you're going to get a lot of years before you have to worry about it. And when you do worry about it, it's going to be just a quick brush up. It's not going to be a major overhaul.
A lot of the things that you showed us today were really great because this is episode 1. And there's going to be another episode with more information about deeper processes. We had someone in the chat asked about, well, what is the not baking soda, the washing soda for? These are things that are coming up on different episodes, but maybe you can give us a little teaser, if you will, of how do I know when I need episode 1 versus episode 2 information?
That gets back to the question. How do you tell what needs help? And this piece I chose very specifically because it shows all stages of rusting. This area right here, there's not a lot of deep rust. It's just surface rust. It's surface rust that if you take a squirt of your your magic rust remover, and you don't even really let it soak in, you just take it and wipe it.
Jesus.
And there's so much rust around it. But if you can wipe it off, that's just surface rust. That is not indicative that the iron itself needs any significant treatment. It's just been exposed to moisture, maybe fingerprints, whatever. Obviously, this is an extreme example. But the reason I like it is this dark rust that's coming through the cracks, this thick rust, that's indicative of what I call invasive rust. That rust is deep inside and it's going to need to be fully stabilized. You're going to need to get all the rust off the surface. It's going to need to be fully stabilized and then resurfaced and sealed up. So when you see a little bit in the cracks, not a huge deal. When you see a lot, even this piece is more than I would recommend somebody doing at home with just a simple cleaning treatment.
Okay.
You see how it's deep in the cracks, and if you flip it over, it's the same. So that means it is all the way through that crack. That's an invasive rust problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
that is going to need a deep penetrating treatment. This is going to get fully stabilized.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to force all the rust out of deep in there. And then it will go through the rest of the process afterwards. So surface rust, fine crack rust that isn't deep, doesn't go all the way through.
But through and through is a whole different story.
It's a whole different story.
Well, if you're not a member of the channel or on YouTube or on Patreon, you're going to miss any questions and conversations and laughs and barbs and all kinds of good stuff. So you should have been a member. What can I say? Bad decision on you. If you subscribe, you'll know when episode 2 and 3 and 7 come out with the rest of Craig Zlimen from Minnesota Meteorites Brain Dump. Thanks a lot, everyone. Appreciate you watching. Have a great week.